So, like Jason said earlier, we're going to talk a little bit about driver selection. And really what I want to focus on when we talk about driver selection is a lot to do with what we've been doing over the past couple years with the MVR program. How important it is to really know who it is that's driving your vehicles and what do you know about them and their driving. And it goes beyond just checking their MVRs and having a good MVR program. But it is a really important key, a really important part of your driver selection program, of course, is going to be knowing what their driver record looks like. You know, when we started this morning, when Travis, oh, why won't my thing go? So when Travis was talking this morning, he mentioned something about our losses. This is actually how that $8 million breaks down over the last 3 years. It's not really a full 3 years. But in 2012, we had almost $6 million in auto liability losses that year. That was a bad one. When I first started working at the trust 10 years ago, we would have, you know, we wouldn't even have $1 million in a year in auto liability. And so we've really had, you know, an increase. The pool's grown. We have a lot more exposure than we've had before. But still, these are really significant. This doesn't just cost the trust. This is, you know, you are the trust. The trust members, you know, this is where your premiums are going to, you know, and when we can control this, we control, you know, what it costs you to be a member of the pool as well. You can control your individual premiums. And so that's really important as well, you know, because when we're talking millions of dollars, you know, that's significant. And a lot of these things come down to some management issues. One of these big losses really involved, you know, being aware of who our drivers were. How do we select drivers? You know, sometimes we have situations come up where if we really knew what a driver's record looked like, we wouldn't have them driving. In fact, we had a member this last year, as they came into the MVR program, we found a driver that had 11 citations on their record. 11! I didn't think that was possible. You know, to have that many citations on your record without losing your license, which this driver had, but the employer didn't know about it. In fact, the employer had found out about it just before they started, you know, the MVR monitoring program with us. And the reason they found out about it was because that driver with 11 citations on his record had an accident. Imagine that. Okay, and so they decided, as they were investigating the accident, to take a look at the driving record, and lo and behold, the driver's got 11 citations, and his license was actually suspended at the time of the accident. You know, what do you think that's going to look like? Let's say you have this event happen, this multi-million-dollar claim. You've got a driver gets involved in a fatal accident. I mean, worst case scenario. What's going to happen? You're going to have reporters coming around asking questions. There's going to be the 10 o'clock news is going to be there in the newspapers. People are going to be putting microphones in front of you and cameras, you know. And you know what reporters can do? Reporters can go and they can access information about someone's driving record. They go and they make an information request, get information about this person's driving record that had this accident, and they come to you and they say, why was this driver operating your vehicle when they had 11 citations on their record and their license was suspended? What are you going to say to that? I didn't know. That's a good quote right there. So it's really important that we know what's going on. You know, we need to be acting reasonable and prudent in managing our fleet, in managing our drivers. It's a huge exposure that we have. So who controls this risk? Is it the driver? Is it the supervisor? Is it the manager? Is it all of the above? Absolutely, it's all of the above. But where do we default usually? The employee, the driver. It's the driver's fault, you know. What could I have done? I wasn't in the car with them. I'm not holding their hand all the time, right? You heard people say stuff like that. Supervisors say stuff like that. We all have a responsibility. Yes, the driver has responsibility, okay? And we need to train the driver, but we need to monitor the driver. A supervisor should know what kind of drivers he has because he should see them driving, or she should see them driving from time to time. Maybe ride with them, you know, at least observe You know, listen to what others have to say about their driving. Do you ever have an employee who complains about another employee's driving? You just dismiss it as someone razzing somebody else? Or do you kind of maybe take that, you know, maybe with a grain of salt, but there's probably some truth behind that. Maybe I should take a look at what's going on. It's the employer. This comes right down to the driver selection process. When we hire someone, most of us, when we hire someone, we're hiring someone that we know is going to be operating our vehicles. Now, some of us have positions that we fill that don't require driving, but most of us have positions that will require driving, and some of us, almost every position will require driving a vehicle. So what is the selection process? You know, do we hire people and we get a photocopy of their driver's license and go, oh, they have a valid license, we're okay. And that's as far as it goes. In fact, you would be surprised. Jason was talking about these denials on the licenses with regards to the CDL, the changes in the CDL requirements for the medical card. And so we've seen a lot of these licenses be denied. And so I'll send out an MVR report to a member and they'll call back and they'll say, but I've got a picture of their license right here and it says it doesn't expire until 2017 or something like that. And they're like, so they have a valid license, what do you mean? Having a card in your pocket with an expiration date does not mean that the license is valid. We have to check with the driver's license division to know if a license is valid or not, you know. So don't just be relying on, oh, here's my license, you know, here's a photocopy of it, keep that in the file, because that doesn't say it all. So we all have responsibility. So we're going to focus quite a bit here in this presentation on the employer responsibility. You know, selecting drivers, authorizing drivers. What are the criteria that we're going to use for making that selection or that authorization? How many of you are participating in the Trust MVR program? I expect a lot of hands, almost all of you, because we're getting really close. Jason, we're pushing 80%. We have, and so we've decided on our liability program, on our liability pool, we've decided to make participation in the MVR program, you know, a mandatory part of the program. And so most of the membership has joined in. We even have a lot of members who are work comp only that aren't in the liability pool participating. So we're getting pretty close to having all the members in there. It's a huge program now. And, you know, as we're doing this, you know, we also recommend that you identify what your criteria are for authorizing people to drive. Now, when we first started, I had people sending me lists of every single employee. Here's all of our employees. And I think there was a little bit of a disconnect there, because actually what we were looking for was a list of the people that you authorize to drive your vehicles. And
you want to work on this while you're...
He's got to make me look better here. So
the camera's not on.
So we get these people saying, you know, here's all my employees. Well, I don't want all your employees. Really, for the MVR program, all I'm really interested in is who have you authorized to drive your vehicles. And so I started seeing things come up on the MVR reports like people with learner's permits. So I had 15-year-old lifeguards, you know, that were being thrown onto the authorized driver list. I hope that 15-year-old lifeguards are not authorized to drive for you or to drive your vehicles. And so I just kind of want to emphasize that. What we're really talking about is who are we authorizing to drive our vehicle. It doesn't necessarily have to be all of our employees.
You can keep going. I just have to move that over onto this screen.
Okay, so who are our authorized employees? Now, they're going to be employees who are driving a vehicle. Both Jason and Travis mentioned employees who may drive their personal vehicles, but on your business, on city, county, district business. And so we've explained that there's still liability exposure there. So some of our members say, well, we don't have any vehicles, so we don't need to do an MVR program. But I'm sure that you still have people who are driving to the office supply store or other things, you know, where that is going to be an authorized driver still. Yeah. And that is a situation where we do have potential exposure because, and that question comes up quite a bit. What about elected officials, board members, and things like that? And as a general rule, now some small cities, you will have city councilmen who are operating city vehicles. You know, they may even be jumping in the snowplow, you know, sometimes in some of these little towns. But even with this, just, you know, a city councilman or a board member who's going to a conference, you know, that's associated with your business, that is travel for business. And so there is the potential there for that liability exposure. It's a little bit tricky, and I'm not telling you exactly what to do. I mean, do you go to a board member who's got a really bad driving record and say, so you're going to have to ride with somebody else because you're not allowed to drive, you know, on our business? You may have a hard time doing that, but if you're aware that you have one of these people with a really bad driving record, you still may want to take some steps to inform them that they're not authorized to operate on behalf of the district, operate a vehicle on behalf of the district. Jason?
So that situation, their insurance would be primary on that accident, but what if it was a bad accident? You know, maybe they had just the state minimum limits, $25,000, and it was a several $100,000 claim that could impact your general liability. So that's why we recommend that you include them. But,
and that's what Travis was explaining earlier, where, you know, they're operating their own vehicle, their insurance is primary, but if they don't have insurance or the losses exceed their coverage, then you could be on the hook for that kind of a situation. So we still do want to exercise what control we can, you know, over. Now that's a worst case scenario. Those probably be the most difficult ones to determine how we're going to exercise some control if they have a bad driving record. If you have a board member with a really bad driving record, that's probably not going to be the case. I mean, we're talking about a very minor portion of the population that has that bad of a driving record. And I'll show you what that is as we get in here, but you may want to, that's a good contingency to think about. We do run MVRs and include city councilmen and board members in our MVR pool if you say that they're authorized to drive and they're on your authorized driver list. We leave it up to you. I'm not auditing your authorized driver list. I'm not coming around and saying, what about this and what about that? It's really up to you to tell me who your authorized drivers are when we include them in the program. But that's something you need to be giving thought to, that we aren't just assuming that everybody's going to drive, that we are giving some thought to who are we authorizing to drive, and we're going to take a look at what kind of a driver they are. And we can do that in different ways. You know, we're going to identify what the qualifications are. So what is it that we're looking for? You know, is it experience, you know, that they've been operating a vehicle for so long? Maybe we're going to be looking at, you know, their history. We do look at their MVR. You know, maybe we give them a driving test. You know, when you're hiring an employee and you know they're going to be driving, maybe part of that vetting process is getting in a vehicle similar to what they're going to be operating and go for a ride with them and actually do that driving test with them. You know, don't just assume that they're a good driver because they've been driving a while. But between the MVR, between a hands-on, you know, test that you may give them, you should be able to get a pretty good feel, you know, for their abilities and their habits behind the wheel. So we're going to be looking at different ways of qualifying our employees. We want you to have a driver qualification policy. Now, if you're participating in the Trust Accountability Program, the TAP program, this is part of TAP. But if you're not participating in TAP, but you're in the MVR program, we still really recommend that you identify your qualification policy, which spells out what's an acceptable driving record and, you know, what action, you know, would be taken under certain circumstances if someone has an accident or has a bad driving record. You know, when we first started looking at this a couple years ago, we threw up a matrix like this that was part of the driver qualification policy. This is just a really down and dirty, simple way of looking at it. Hey, if you've got so many at-fault accidents or so many tickets, then, you know, you're up or down. Or we leave this kind of borderline area where an administrator may have discretion in determining whether to let someone keep driving privileges or hire that person for a driving function or not. So that's really simple. Of course, you're going to want in a policy to address details a little more in depth. This is actually part of what we have in our current sample that we send out. This isn't the whole policy, but it is just a one-page policy, the sample that we've sent out. But basically, you know, we put it in writing this time instead of just in a graphic. You know, up to 2 violations, up to 1 at-fault accident in the last 3 years would be fine. Now, this isn't telling you what you're going to do. This is a suggestion. This is a sample. It's a recommendation. You may decide to have it be more stringent or less stringent than this. You know, you can have that borderline area, 3 or 4 citations in the last 3 years, where the chief administrator may, you know, exercise discretion in that area, or 2 at-fault accidents. You know, but really understand, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint a picture for you as we go through here today, what the risks are associated with the driving record. You know, what are the risks as someone has more violations on their driving record? What does the risk look like when someone's had more at-fault accidents? But we really encourage you to make sure that you have something similar to this where you have defined this is what an acceptable driver looks like, or this is what an acceptable driving record looks like, and make sure that we take a look at that. A lot of questions come up when we start this program, okay, and people say, well, for one thing, do we need the employee's permission to run their driving record? What do you think? You ever seen those forms that you had to get people to sign to get their driving record? And those forms do exist, you know, and most employers would need to get the employee to sign that piece of paper to get that driving record. However, when we run the driving records, there is an exception. There's several exceptions that can apply. I can run the driving record because I'm your insurance company. I don't have to get anybody's authorization to do it. I don't have to get a waiver from the driver because we're the insurance company. We can get that information. Okay, just like your personal insurance company probably runs your MVR every now and then and checks up on you. We can do the same thing. But there's another one that applies to us because we're government. Okay, all of you are government entities. We're a government entity. And so there's another exception that allows us to check the driving record of somebody if it's part of our normal government function. So hiring employees, designating drivers, authorizing people to operate government vehicles or to drive automobiles on government business, that's part of the normal function, and so we use that exception too. So actually, I don't need you to get the authorization forms from all your employees. You know, we are allowed to run those records on your drivers because they're operating for a government. Yes?
What if they're not employees yet? What if you're pre-hired, you know, plan on hiring somebody or you want to find out?
That's still a part of your, hiring someone is still a part of your normal operation, your normal function, you know, as a government entity, so. Well, yes, and we're going to talk about reasonable suspicion while we're eating lunch today. And that's another way. And that's another way to do it, and they don't have to sign any kind of an authorization to, you know, to provide you with a copy. They go down and pay the $9 or whatever it is to get a copy of their MVR and bring it to you, and that's good for pre-hire. We also, if you're in our MVR program and you send me, you know, the information, I'll run the MVR for you and let you know whether they have a clean record or not, you know, even if in that pre-screening phase. But we need to make sure and help me out. You know, you're not running your daughter's boyfriend's MVR and saying that, you know, we're interviewing this guy. Don't get me in trouble. Yes. That they have to, so. That they have to have a good driving record, or that they need to provide a driving record, or both. So you can inform them in the job posting. That's good. Yes.
You say, oh, you can get the cover, but some of it aren't absolutely covered. So I'm wondering, in that case, is it better to just sign?
We would probably want to look at that in a little more detail. If you're a member of the trust, you have to have a government aspect to your operation. and you have, and you're organized under a charter, okay. Well, we may want to look at that, so talk to us about that afterwards, and so we can make sure we're doing that right and make sure we may need to ask some questions on that. Regardless, we're your insurance company. We can run the records just because we're insuring the driver. So, but let's take a look at that. So, do we need permission? In most cases, no. We just give us the information. We'll keep track of that, run those records. What about privacy? We have a lot of employees that are really reluctant to give us their driver's license number. And it's really difficult for us to do a monitoring program. I have to have a driver's license number. I can run a record off of a name and a birthday, but the programs that we use to actually do a monthly monitoring don't work unless I have a complete, correct driver's license number. And some employees have been kind of reluctant to give that up because they think they're protecting, their privacy. And, we have to protect that privacy too. When we're managing these programs, we have to make sure we're following state and federal law to make sure that that data is kept secure. And so, your employees, if they want to be authorized to drive for you, they need to give you a driver's license number. And so we have the right to insist that they provide us with that information if they want to drive your vehicle or drive on your business, okay? So we do need that. We do work and take measures to protect privacy. However, when we look at a driving record, there is some private information in there, personal identification information, but it's not all there like people may think it is. Do we need to include elected officials? So we kind of talked about that. There is an exposure there, so you do need to consider that as you're doing your driver authorization program and determining that, and think about that. And a lot of our members are putting those people on their driver lists that are part of their monitoring program. What if there's an error on the MVR? So I send you your MVR report back, and your employee, says that it's wrong. I don't have a ticket on my record, or my license is valid. It's not suspended or denied or whatever. And I've had these calls where, if someone says, "Hey, I'm talking to the employee. They're telling me that this is wrong." All I can tell you is what the MVR says. I'm not managing the MVR itself. That's the state of Utah, the driver's license division. And so it's really important when you have issues come up as you're monitoring the driver's license records, as you're looking at the MVRs, if the driver says it's wrong, it's their responsibility to go to the driver's license division and work it out with them. If there's a ticket on there that shouldn't be on there, then they're going to have to figure that out, because I can't help what's on the MVR and I can't change what's on the MVR. So the driver will have some responsibility to address those things. And again, if we don't own any vehicles, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're not driving vehicles. Just because we don't own them doesn't mean that your entity doesn't have liability exposure for the operation of vehicles associated with, performing your functions. Here's what an MVR looks like. It's mine, by the way. So I have just shared with you all the personal identification information that can be seen on an MVR. So as you can see on there, it only shows the last 4 digits of the driver's license number. So it doesn't give a complete driver's license number. So when I run an MVR, if I'm just doing it off of the name and the birthday, I don't know what the driver's license number is. It'll let me pull this record, but I still don't even know what the full driver's license number is. That's why it's so important that you provide that to me. Otherwise, I can't get it. So we have to have that full driver's license number. There's my full name. You all know my middle name is Edward now, if you didn't know that already. And my birthday. That's the extent of the personal identification information there. My full name and my birthday. There's no social security number. There's not even an address on here. So, yes, it is personal identification information. Yes, we do need to guard it, but also you can help people feel at ease a little bit when we're looking at this. We're not seeing their credit score, when we run a driver's license record. We're seeing a birthday and a name. That's our confirmation that this is the same person. And beyond that, we don't get any other personal identification information. Yes?
I was just wondering if you renewed.
I did renew. Actually, this PDF was done for a presentation last year, but yes, I did renew my license. I ran this right after a ticket dropped off my record, though, so that it would show that I have a clean record now. And when I run these MVRs, you know, when we first started doing this, I had one speeding ticket on my record. And I was really glad when it came off because I didn't feel like a hypocrite, you know, telling people to run and check MVRs. Not that I'm saying you would disqualify anybody for one ticket only, but I think it's really a good idea to strive to keep a clean driving record, and your employees should strive to keep a good driving record too. When we do this program, let your employees know that you're monitoring their driving record so that they want to keep it clean. If I know my employer is going to see a report every month on my driving record and my employer is going to know if I get a ticket for something or other, then maybe I'm have a little more motivation to, you know, not get that ticket in the first place. And the behaviors that lead to getting tickets, honestly, do contribute to the risk of someone being involved in an accident. And a lot of companies out there are really serious about these driving records too. I have a son that lives in Portland, Oregon, and last year he had a chance to get what I would have considered a dream job at his age. In fact, I'd probably quit my job to go do this job today, you know, if I had a chance. And he had interviewed with Roush Engineering, and they have an outfit there in Portland where they do some of their testing of equipment. So different car manufacturers that use different engineered products, whether they be engineered by Roush or they just want Roush to test their parts for them. They send them cars and they have to drive so many miles on these cars and they have to do all sorts of crazy things with them depending on what they're testing. Like one car they were testing, one of the daily things they had to do to the car was a full throttle reverse to drive shift. That sounds like fun, doesn't it? Right? They have to try and break the car. And so this is kind of like a dream job. You get to spend your whole day trying to break cars and driving really cool cars. Anyway, so my son interviewed for this job, and he had a contingent job offer. He was going to get to go be a test car driver for Roush, you know, Engineering. And guess what? He had a couple speeding tickets on his record, and they wouldn't hire him. Here, they want to hire someone to go try and break cars, but if you got a bad driving record, you're not driving for us. And so, I mean, we're not the only ones saying, look at your driving record. You know, it's a common thing that fleet operators do, is pay attention to their driver's driving record. Okay, so what should be included in your MVR program? You should look at your driver's MVRs at least once a year. Now, I've mentioned monthly, and in our program that we put together, we send a report out once a month saying if there were any changes on the records last year or last month in the prior month. And so that's even better because we know kind of real time if something's going on. But you should at least, you know, if you're not in our program or doing something else, you should take a look at the MVR once a year, I think. If you have to pay for that, it gets kind of expensive, and that's kind of nice because our program doesn't cost anything. The state doesn't, because we're government, the state doesn't charge us to run the MVRs. A private company would have to pay $9 a throw. So if you're talking thousands of drivers, that's a lot of money. So we're kind of lucky there. Lots of our members have employees who are not Utah residents, okay? If you're in Cache County, if you're in Washington County, Grand County, you know, we see the occasional Idaho, Colorado, Nevada, Arizona license, you know, in our pool because that driver is not a Utah resident. Our program only gives us access to Utah records. So I can't monitor your out-of-state, your non-resident drivers for you. So for your non-resident drivers, your program should probably include having the driver provide you with a copy of their MVR at least annually from their resident state. A lot of you have people driving who have moved here from someplace else. And I notice as I've monitored this program that we can go 6 months or a year and we have someone living in Lehigh who, you know, still has a California driver's license. Right? That's part of this too. I mean, we want to make sure that if they're a Utah resident, they should legally have a Utah license, right? And so if they really are not a Utah resident, that's one thing. But if they're living here and they gave you an out-of-state license, we need to make sure that they actually get a Utah license at some point, hopefully before it's too long down the road. If you want us to help you check new hires, we can do that. But you definitely should have that as part of your pre-hire process, your screening process. You know, if that person is going to be driving, make sure you take a look at their MVR. What about accidents? How do you know if someone's had an accident? Google? You know, it may be. Is somebody suing them? It doesn't show up on the MVR. And so it's really important that when it comes to accidents, if you have employees who have on-the-job accidents, especially where you're aware of the accident, keep a record of that. That should be part of your qualification standard, but it doesn't show on the MVR at-fault accident. When someone has an accident, the police officer rolls up and they decide why the accident happened, and they write a citation. And the only thing you see on the MVR is a citation for improper something or other, usually is what they write. It could be failure to yield if they ran a stop sign or whatever. My son, about 4 years ago, fell asleep at the wheel one night and crashed into a parked car. He got cited for improper lane change. So you'll see these, especially when you see those improper whatever, tickets. I usually think that that's probably an accident, but you don't know. And so if you're aware of your employees having accidents, especially if it's on the job, have a way of keeping track of that, because you do want to know if they're repeat offenders and having accidents. I had a member call me one time, and they had a police officer who'd had an at-fault accident every year for the last 3 years. And they wanted to know, if they could discipline them or fire them. I said, well, gee, driving is kind of a necessary function for most police officers, right? And if you can't keep yourself from having an at-fault accident once a year, maybe driving shouldn't be a job you're doing. And so absolutely, that is something that we need to be considering. Your observations, supervisors, you should, on some regular basis, once a year while you're preparing the annual performance evaluation or something, make an effort to take a look at how you think your drivers drive. Do a ride along with them or do an observation of their driving, something. And that can be part of your program as well. So it's not just the MVR that we're relying on solely, but it is a great tool to help us. Okay. Yeah. Well, and Jason said that would be a good idea. The standards that we hold a CDL operator to are good standards for everybody. The sample is there as a sample, okay? And a lot of people will just have their driver program mirror the CDL requirements. However, you can't totally mirror it because we can't hold everybody to the random drug testing standard that the CDL operator is held to. If we're a government, you can have that be the same, and that's fine. But if you're not a CDL operator, we can't, just for that reason alone, just because you're driving, we can't put you into a random drug sampling pool. There are some issues that we've talked about not doing random sampling on employees unless they're safety sensitive or it's required by some law like the motor carriers laws. So our program, we can help you with pre-hire checks. We do a monthly monitoring. So we run, right now we have 9,200 drivers actually worked into the program. We've got some in the hopper still, but we run those records every month for a yes or no response on whether there's been a change in their record. And we share with you a report every month that shows have violations dropped off their record, or has a new violation come onto their record, and so you get a monthly report that will tell you, what's going on with your driver's records. You don't have to wait till the end of the year to run an MVR and find out that someone had a DUI 9 months ago. We can find out, next month, hopefully. Violations don't show up until there's a conviction, though. Sometimes court dates get drawn out, but with a DUI, there's usually two entries on the MVR. One's called a per se arrest, and then you have the actual, you know, DUI or DWI. The per se arrest will show up on there, and it doesn't give you any detail. It doesn't tell you if it was a metabolite conviction or a DUI, DWI, whatever. But if it says a per se on there and it'll have the date when the per se arrest occurred, you know it's drug or alcohol related. And so we will see those, you know, come up, you know, pretty quickly. Doesn't cost you anything as trust members to have us help you with this program, so that works really well. Pretty soon we're going to have an online platform. We have developers right now writing a web application for us that will actually do this whole MVR program online. So instead of sending me all your driver's information, you'll just be able to log into a secure portal and enter your driver's information yourself and extract your reports yourself anytime you want them. And so that'll kind of be more self-managed. It probably won't be any more work for you than it is to just put the information together and send it to me. But then we don't have to re-enter it, and you don't have to wait for us to send you a report. The program will automatically email you your monthly reports, or you can go in and extract a report anytime you want. And so that's in the development process. We hope within the next couple months that we'll have that available to you. So that's coming up. Currently, this is what the monthly report looks like that we send out to you. You know, if you don't see it, if you're not the person who sees it, this is basically what we get. We've got a performance box up there at the top. It shows how many drivers you have, if any of them have invalid licenses, if any of them have had 3 violations in the last 3 years, or 4 or more violations in the last 3 years. So we kind of flag those for you because that's kind of where we think it's really important to really start paying attention. At 3 is where that risk starts to become really high. And so we'll flag those on your report. If there's any incomplete data, like we need, you know, that complete driver's license number, the information you gave us, there was a digit missing from the driver's license number or something. Down here at the bottom of the report, we have this section called information needed, and that's where I'll ask you to re-verify information that isn't working when we put it into the system. So here you see Douglas Edward Folsom has an error in his driver's license number, and if you can just check those for us, you know, in that bottom section. The middle section here, this big one here, and I changed the names to protect the innocent or the not so innocent on this report, but you know, you'll see on here, that section will show all the violations for all of your drivers that are currently on their MVR. It'll show a conviction date so you know how old that ticket is. You'll also know when it falls off, because if it's a moving violation, it comes off in 3 years. Okay, and that's another thing we do right now. Every month I go through and I make sure that we pull out all the violations that are 3 years old, you know, and drop those from the report so that your driver's records clean up for your sake, and you can see that happening, and hopefully, you know, give your drivers kudos for keeping a good record. As their record cleans up, or if they have a perfectly clean record, we can give them encouragement on that. The other section down here towards the bottom is where I'll put information that's leaving the report. So these were citations that were 3 years old, they dropped off, and so they're not in this main section up here, but I'll just put them in there for 1 month only to let you know, hey, these dropped off last month. So those citations are no longer showing on this driver's MVR. Next month, that will be blank unless there's more that drop off. So that's what our report that we send out to you every month looks like right now. Benefits, you can control your risk. It's not just the driver that has to be careful. You know, we are participants in controlling these risks. So when I know I've got a driver who has 2 or 3 speeding tickets or 4 speeding tickets, I have some control there. I can decide, or hopefully we have a policy that states, you know, what action we take at that point so that we don't have this risk floating out there continually. A bad driver doesn't have to drive. You can let somebody else drive that person, or maybe you say driving is an essential function of your job and you must have a good driving record in order to have your job. And we've seen a lot of people drop off of the MVR program because they had bad driving records and they're no longer employed with the city or the county. And that's kind of sad. I hate to say that, you know, people are getting fired over this, but if you have to drive and you have a lousy driving record, that's a consequence that can go along with that territory. So it gives you control over the risks. If you've got valid licenses or not. Now, this whole thing that came up about the CDL denied licenses with these changes with the medical card this last year, there were dozens and dozens of drivers in the pool who didn't know that their license was invalid. When there was a mistake on that program for submitting your medical card, they just invalidated your license. They just put denied, and it wasn't just your CDL endorsement. It was your whole license. When it said license status, it says denied. When it says commercial status, it says disqualified. And so we had dozens and dozens of drivers out there driving vehicles for the members every day, and they had invalid licenses, and the DLD never told them. And so that's a benefit that comes up. We know if we've got valid licenses or not using this program. And those guys, all those guys were able to just go down with a quick trip to the DLD, check a box and fix the problem. It was an easy fix, but in the meantime, they were illegal drivers and didn't even know it. If your CDLs are valid, sometimes they'll see a valid license, but a denied CDL. So when we initially run this report, we can let you know. So just in case you think that person's a CDL driver and their endorsement is not valid. You can also use this to identify training needs. If I've got a high percentage of my employees who have tickets on their record, I may think, maybe we need to do a defensive driving class. Okay, so that can help us know where we need to focus some attention, and I hope it motivates drivers. That's why I say let your employees know their records are being monitored. I want them, not that it's a bad thing, if they've got clean records, give them a high five. Thank them for being good drivers. But we want them to know if they get a ticket, you're going to know about it. And so let's drive safe and not get that ticket in the first place. What we found is we've done this program. Like I said, we had 9,200 records currently that we're monitoring. We're probably about 10,000 actually when we get everything processed that's been submitted to us. And so that's a lot. And so when we talk about statistical results from this, we have a very solid statistical sample here of what our drivers' driving records look like. We have 1,885 violations that are current on those 9,200 records that we've looked at. And actually what we see from that is about 15% of those 9,200 drivers have at least one ticket on their record, one or more ticket on their record or some problem with their license. But that means 85% of them have perfectly clean records. And that's actually amazing because nationwide, fleet operators will have a driver, what I call a violator rate of probably around 30%. So if you just look at the general driving population, about 25 to 35% of drivers have at least one ticket on their record. But in our pool, we only have 15% of our drivers. So we are obviously doing something in screening for better drivers. We have a lot of CDL operators in our pool, and CDL operators tend to have better driving records too because they have that motivation to keep their record clean because it does mean their job. It means this professional endorsement that they have. But that's a really a good thing. The longer we have groups in this monitoring program, the more this violator rate drops. And so the more people know their driving records are being monitored, the better the driving records are getting. And we've been doing this for a year and a half, almost 2 years now. And so the only thing that really keeps our violator rate around 15% is the fact that we've had thousands and thousands of brand new records coming into the program. When we first started, it was more like 18 or 19%. And the longer we had people in the program, either you decided to take people off your driver list that weren't good drivers, or drivers have, tried to keep their records cleaner, but that violator rate's been going down. So that's really good thing that we found as we go through here. Also, what we found as we've run those 9,200 records, we found over 130 drivers currently identified as authorized drivers for members who had invalid licenses. Some of those licenses were suspended. Some of them a lot were expired. I couldn't believe how many people didn't, renew their license 6 months after it expired, and the employer didn't know it either, and so they're driving your vehicle, their license is expired, and the renewal card's sitting on the kitchen table, for 6 months, right? Or it's denied, and sometimes denied doesn't always mean a snafu on the records for the CDL, but a big chunk of those were things going on with the medical card. In fact, Jason mentioned this medical self-certification. And that form, if you're a CDL operator, you got a form sent out to you and it was telling you what you needed to do. And if you flip that form over on the back side, and maybe this is why it got missed a lot because it was on the back of the form, there's this medical self-certification where you have to identify what kind of driving you do. And there's 4 boxes that you have to check there. You have to pick which one represents the driving that you do, and you have to check one of those boxes. This is why all these guys were getting their licenses denied, and they didn't even know it because they weren't flipping the paper over and checking one box. That's it. And then nobody was telling you that your license was denied either. So that's a good thing to, if you've got guys that are renewing their licenses, they have to submit if they haven't done this yet, make sure they know, hey, flip over the paper, check one of those 4 boxes on the back for your medical self-certification, otherwise your license will be denied. So what's the risk? I told you that as we go through here, I'm going to tell you, how do we weigh the risk associated with somebody's driving record? What does an MVR tell us? A driver, does it tell us they're likely to have an accident? Is someone who has 2 speeding tickets, are they really more likely to have an accident than someone who has no speeding tickets? What do you think? Or are they just unlucky? It's statistically, it's measurable. If you have even 1 ticket on your record, statistically, you are more likely to be involved in an accident than someone who has no tickets on their record. So what we actually see when we look at this, statistically, we can see if you, in the prior 3 years, have had tickets, this is the increased risk of you being involved in an accident. So if in the prior 3 years you have had 1 speeding ticket, your risk of being involved in an accident in the next 3 years is 49% greater. So you have almost a 50% greater chance of being involved in an accident just because you had 1 ticket. Okay, I'm not telling anybody to kick out drivers because they have 1 ticket. Okay. But the measurable risk starts with 1 ticket. Once you have 2 tickets in the prior 3 years, your risk of an accident in the next 3 years is 86% greater than someone who has nothing on their record. And remember, 85% of our drivers have nothing on their record. We're talking about a minority group here. In fact, when we get to someone with 3 tickets on their record, we're only talking about maybe 1% of our drivers, out of this whole group. They're 118%. They're more than twice as likely to have an accident in the next 3 years if they have 3 tickets on their record. And that's why, when I send out that sample and we say up to 2 is okay, after 3 you need to start thinking about it, because at 3 tickets, that person is twice as likely to have an accident than someone with a good record. 4 tickets, 136% more likely. 168% more likely with 5 tickets, and over 200% more likely, or 3 times as likely to have an accident if they have 6 tickets. This is rare. I think I came across 1 guy out of 9,000 records that had 11 tickets. I think the next most frequent one I saw was maybe a 6. There may have been 1 of those. I've seen a few with 5, and I've seen a few with 4, but it's just a handful. There are not many people out there with a driving record that bad. It is a fraction of a percent of drivers that have 4 tickets on their record. So if you've got a guy who comes in and you're talking to him about his driving record, and he says, hey, it's just a speeding ticket, it's just 3 speeding tickets, or it's just 4 speeding tickets, don't make a big deal out of it. Well, it is a big deal. And the guy who doesn't think it's a big deal is probably a greater risk because he thinks that. He's too confident. He thinks he can bend the rules and be unsafe, and it's not going to affect him. So really, take a look at this. If we look at accidents that they have, and I know finding out about accidents is a little bit more difficult. Insurance companies probably have better information about who's had an accident than what you're going to get from the driver's license division. But someone who's had 1 at-fault accident in the prior 3 years is 63% more likely to have another one in the next 3 years. Someone with 2 at-fault accidents in the prior 3 years is 150% more likely, and someone who's had 3 at-fault accidents in the prior 3 years is 3 times as likely to have another accident in the next 3 years. So when that HR manager calls me and says, hey, I've got this employee who's had an at-fault accident every year for the last 3 years, should I let him drive? What's my answer? No, absolutely not. I mean, that's a huge risk. 3 times as likely to have an accident? No, I don't want to let him drive. Okay. So, what's in your future? Do you have one of those multi-million-dollar claims, one of those multi-million-dollar accidents in your future? Or is it hiding out there? You don't know. We don't have the crystal ball, okay? But how we manage our risks, will really have a great impact on the likelihood of that actually happening to us. We don't want that to happen. We don't want to be involved in someone being maimed, critically injured or killed. That's the last thing we want to have happen. Just the human cost isn't worth it. So what we do could prevent these things. Are we paying attention to what kind of drivers we have? Do we have a good program for authorizing drivers and for making sure we only have good drivers behind the wheel for us? Are we acting reasonable and prudent? It's not just the driver. It's the person who hands the driver the keys who's also responsible. And so we need to make sure we're doing our part. So make sure that, you have a driver qualification policy. If you're driving for work or if you have a fleet, make sure that you identify what requirements an employee must meet in order to have those keys handed to them. The MVR is just a tool, that we use to help us manage this risk, but it's also hopefully a motivation. I want to keep my driving record clean, okay? I don't want to sit here and tell you all that this is important and then have stuff on my record too. It's a motivator for me looking at my own driving record every month, and I get to tell myself, good job, Doug. Keep that record clean. Use that for your employees, give them kudos for having good driving records. Do drivers exercise good judgment? You're going to learn that when you look at their driving record. When they have, even if it's it could be an old DUI. If I've got someone who comes in and I look at their MVR and they've got a 7-year-old DUI and not one other thing on their driving record, what should I think? They're not speeding. They're not running stop signs or intersections. They're not failing to yield. Looks to me like someone who learned their lesson. But if I see someone who's got maybe an old DUI and current speeding tickets, then I'm going to think, where I'm weighing that DUI, if it's an old one, I may think, I wonder if this person's really learned their lesson. They're still out there driving fast. Their attitude about driving and the danger associated with it maybe hasn't fully adjusted yet. So it's a tool. It helps us determine what kind of judgment our drivers exercise. It's not the only tool that we're going to use, but also we need to make sure that we have implemented policies and procedures that are reasonable and prudent, that can demonstrate if we do have that multi-million-dollar incident happen, that we can say, this is what we do. We check all of our drivers' MVRs. We do on-road tests. We do an annual evaluation of this person. We make them get training. If you've got this program laid out and you're following it and this bad incident happens, it's going to be more defensible. You're not likely to get the public, the PR black eye that you would if it was that guy with 11 tickets having an accident and you didn't know about it. And so it really is a way to help us manage the risk, even if the bad event does happen. It makes it more defensible for us. Bad drivers don't have to drive. You may be a small entity. You may have just 1 or 2 drivers. That is not a reason to say, I have to let this guy drive. He has 4 tickets, but, he has to drive. He does not. He doesn't have to be your driver. If someone represents that risk and we're being reasonable and prudent, we're going to use that information. We're going to find a way to control that risk. I'm not going to give that person the keys. Maybe I find another way for that person to get their job done, or maybe that person just doesn't qualify for the job. If driving really is that important. But remember, bad drivers don't have to drive. Any questions about driver qualification, driver selection? A lot of tools at your disposal. We just have to make sure we're doing something. When we started this 2 years ago, the norm was for our members to just see a copy of a driver's license, and that's all they needed. Most people, when we asked them, what's your driver qualification, they said a valid license, okay? And when you think about the risk that's out there and the millions of dollars that this pool has been paying out over the last several years from vehicle accidents, I hope you share, you know, that feeling that we have for the importance of controlling this risk. Just looking to see if someone has a valid license or that they have a license in their pocket, that doesn't cut it. We've got to make sure we're doing something. Lunch should be here in a few minutes. I was hoping it would. Oh, lunch is here. So let's go ahead and break for lunch. We'll go back. Lunch is set up on the back table there. We will start the next presentation as you're eating, but we'll give you 10 or 15 minutes to get your food and get settled down and before we start again.
So there's box lunches, bag lunches. So there's ham or no? Sorry. We got turkey and roast beef. Roast beef on the left, other ham. Turkey is on the right. Wow. Anyway, we take about 15 minutes to get our lunches and that, and we'll continue on with the presentation. I printed up the application for employment for CDL operators. Back there. Does everybody know? Oh yeah, that was the other thing I was going to say. Every room over in our room, the big room, if you want a soft drink, you can get that there. And chocolate. Oh, sure.
Okay. So what we want to talk about now with the rest of our time is we want to talk about reasonable suspicion. Actually, I appreciate the question came up earlier about reasonable suspicion. We talk about drug testing. We talk about random drug testing versus other reasons or causes for doing drug testing. And so we talk about reasonable suspicion because, number one, in my book, it's probably the best way to manage whether you have employees with issues with drug or alcohol and your policy. Lots of times we'll have people who will call and they'll have members of the public who get kind of upset and they'll ask, why doesn't the city drug test all their employees? You know, my employer drug tests me all the time. Why doesn't the city do the same thing? And of course, like we mentioned to you in other trainings, you know, because most of us are government entities, it prevents us from just randomly drug testing people because, you know, there are constitutional issues when it comes to government conducting searches and seizures of people, and the Supreme Court has ruled that a drug sample, collecting a urine sample or some other means of producing a sample for a drug test is a search and a seizure. And so as a government entity, we can't just do those willy-nilly, right? You know, they have to have a warrant or other things like this. And so we have to be really careful about doing drug tests. However, reasonable suspicion is not a random drug test. We have cause, we have reason. Utah state statute allows for conducting reasonable suspicion determination for local government entities and their employees as well. And so this is a really good tool, whether we're talking about drivers or just any of your employees. And so as we go through, we're going to talk a little bit about why the problem, what is it that we're concerned with when we think about the need to do drug testing or alcohol testing, and you know, what are the resources that are available to us when we're doing this. As public employees, sometimes we may have folks who have safety-sensitive jobs. We can still do a random drug test on employees with safety-sensitive jobs. The Supreme Court has outlined certain conditions or certain situations where that random test can occur. One, for sure, is the CDL operator, because we have federal law that requires that random testing pool. But also, if we're talking about police and firefighters, those are definitely safety-sensitive jobs. What those employees are doing, you know, can easily result in, you know, serious injury or death to others. if they're doing their job incorrectly or if they're under the influence. So that would definitely be a safety sensitive job. And so there may be other situations, operating heavy equipment, handling hazardous chemicals that present a hazard to the public. I mean, we can find other ways where we can classify people as safety sensitive. So just because we talk about not doing random drug testing doesn't mean you can't, but we just need to make sure that, you know, we're doing it within the scope of the law, identifying where there is a safety sensitive position. You know, we do it because we're concerned about employee safety. We do it because we're concerned about the public safety as well. I mean, if we are interacting with the public, operating vehicles or machinery around the public, of course, it's a risk to others, not just our employees. The risk is to the person who may be under the influence of drugs or alcohol. The risk is to his coworker working next to him or anybody, you know, in the vicinity. We want to make sure that we understand, because reasonable suspicion determination, that is that avenue that is available to us at any time when we have that cause, that reasonable suspicion, where we can do a drug test and get that information. You know, drug and alcohol use is very prevalent in our society. Some of it's legal, some of it's not legal. And so when we talk about drug testing and alcohol testing, those are two different things. And so as we go through here today, we'll talk a little bit about what the differences are. You know, alcohol, consumption of alcohol is legal, but we don't want people under the influence on the job. So how we address that and how we look at it and what constitutes a failure when it comes to our policies or whatever needs to be a little bit different than maybe the illicit use of drugs. But even it may not be illicit use of drugs. It could be just the abuse of something someone has a prescription for. And so, but we do look at drug and alcohol testing a little bit different. We know that if someone's under the influence of drugs or alcohol, it increases the risk. It increases the chance of death, of injury in the workplace or out of the workplace. So we need to increase our awareness of the hazards that are associated with drug and alcohol use. We need to make sure that we are able to identify what the signs are that we're looking for. If I'm going to have reasonable suspicion of someone being under the influence of drug or alcohol, then I need to know what that is. What does that look like? In fact, when we do a reasonable suspicion determination training, and that's what this will qualify as today for those of you that are here, we're required to do 60 minutes of training on, you know, alcohol, recognition of use and abuse of alcohol, 60 minutes of training on the recognition of use and abuse of drugs and why it's important. So this last section here is intended to fill that requirement. We need to understand when we're talking about reasonable suspicion determination, you know, what that means, when we can be looking for these signs and symptoms that people may be having, you know, where, how do we document it, you know, not just how do we recognize it, but what's the procedure we actually need to go through when we're making that reasonable suspicion determination. Supervisors need to be empowered. They need to know that they can make this decision based on the right reasons, okay? And so it's important, and I just actually had a call during the first part of our summit today from a member who's not here asking me about this. They had a supervisor who they feel failed to conduct a reasonable suspicion determination that should have. Well, the question is, was that supervisor trained? So if we have employees, supervisors that we expect to be monitoring our employees and make a reasonable suspicion determination, they need to make sure that they've had this training before they do that. Know that if you do and you do it right, you're protected. A lot of people are afraid, well, what if I think this person's under the influence and I take them down for a drug test and I was wrong? Am I going to be in trouble? And the answer is no, as long as you're doing the process appropriately. You know, just kind of an example of how prevalent the use of drug and alcohol is in our society. There was a study that was done several years ago in Michigan that kind of looked at high school seniors and how many of them had tried different types of drugs. And in that study, in the prior 30 days of these high school seniors, 44% of them had used alcohol. Okay, we're talking about minors. They're not legally consuming alcohol. In the prior 2 months, 66% of these high school seniors had used alcohol. 31% had used marijuana, and 18% had used marijuana in the prior 30 days. These are just teenagers. So as soon as we're not teenagers anymore, that goes away, right? We grow up, we get mature, we don't, use illicit drugs anymore, we don't abuse alcohol. Unfortunately, that's not the case. These things kind of stay with us. In fact, in society as a whole, we see that 80% of all Americans will have tried an illicit drug by the time they're 25 years old. And so it's not an uncommon thing. About 8% of all workers use illicit drugs, and over half of those share their illicit drugs on the job. So if you have somebody, in your workforce and they are using illicit drugs, chances are it's not just the one person. Chances are they're bringing it to work and they're sharing it with others, and it's spreading. So it's important that we be aware and that we empower our supervisors what to be aware of and what to look for. 75% of drug users indicate that they use drugs at work. 45% of drug users indicate that they have sold drugs to coworkers. So kind of the same information, different source for the statistics. Is it a problem? Yes. It costs industry a lot of money. It costs money in lost productivity, in injury, illness, death. Someone who is an illicit drug user is 33% less productive at work. When it comes to alcohol, you again have lost productivity, more absenteeism. You have more health problems. Drinkers are more likely to miss work because of that issue. They're 3 times as likely to use their medical benefits. So in other words, they're more likely to drive the costs associated with your medical premiums. Now, is that a reason I'm going to do it? No, I'm really going to focus on safety and safety on the job, but it is a real problem. There are costs associated with it. 40% of industrial accidents, people who die because of an incident that occurs on the job, alcohol is related to that incident in one way or another. Drug users represent a 260% increase in workplace accidents. So that is in their 400% or 5 times more likely to file a work comp claim, which is kind of interesting because they're less than 3 times as likely to have an accident, but they're 5 times as likely to claim a workplace injury. So there's a little bit of what we call a moral hazard there. You have morale hazards and you have moral hazards. And so the illicit drug user is more likely to feign a workplace injury or blame a non-work injury on something that happened at work. Drug abuse, alcohol abuse, it destroys lives, it destroys families, it destroys careers, and it's a danger at the same time. So there's a lot of reasons we want to try and control this problem. Why do people use or abuse drugs and alcohol? Here's a couple that are just listed here. Experimentation, wanted to try it out, my friends were doing it, peer pressure, whatever, recreational, stress relief. Can you think of any other reasons why people might use and abuse? Peer pressure, my buddy's doing it, pressures me into it. That might go right along with that guy in the 8% who uses and brings it to work and, pressures somebody else to do the same, right? Think of any other reasons? Could be abuse of prescription, right? Or it could be not understanding the effects of prescription, but really when we talk about, a violation of our policy, we're probably looking at abuse of prescription. Can we tell? Yes, we can. We do a drug test. We can tell if someone's using their prescription more than what's prescribed. So that requires a little more in-depth testing, but that can be determined. Any other reasons? Have addiction? Yeah. Maybe it starts out as experimentation or recreational, but it can turn into addiction. And addiction is really hard, makes it much more difficult for someone to get past that problem as well. How about this one?
none of us know very much about this drug in any verifiable way. Well, Bill, it's been about 2 hours since you got the drug, man. How do you feel? Fantastic. Friend? Not at all. Business-like? Not at all. Sheesh. Friendly. Strange. That's so ridiculous.
Would you be interested in taking part in a study like this again? Having the same type of drug?
Sure.
It's been a very pleasant experience for you.
All anytime you want. Do you think it would be any time at all? This is called any time of the day. We found out that the drug makes people happy, it makes them intoxicated, and finally makes them sleepy, which is about what marijuana users were telling us happened all the time.
That was a pretty good dose of THC out there, wasn't it? Okay. It feels good. I like it. There's a reason right there. Okay. But do you want Bill on the clock for you? Right? Business-like? Not at all. Right? Does he care? Not at all. You know, he's not going to be productive for you. He's feeling good. You know, not that we don't want to feel good, but, you know, that kind of gets in the way of other things that we need to do. So, you know, there's a lot of different reasons why it happens, you know, and it is a risk that we need to be aware of. Abuse versus addiction. Now, of course, alcohol is a legal substance, you know, but where it's being abused, it can be a problem on the job. You know, it's no guarantee that people are going to come to work drunk, you know, if they have an abuse problem, but it's much more likely. You know, if we're talking about abuse, we're talking about, you know, using a substance in a way to modify our mood or our mental state, you know, and so if I don't use a drug to modify my mental state, you know, I use a drug that's prescribed for health reasons, you know, but addiction, you know, is a step beyond that. I may be abusing a drug to modify my state of mind, but if I get addicted, then it gets to a point where I can't quit. I may have repeated failures at quitting. I have an increased tolerance, and so I use more than I would. To get that feeling that I want to get, it's going to take more. You know, it's going to be a disruption in the workplace because I'm not going to care about work so much, or I'm going to be impaired, my ability to perform the job, you know, to focus, to function, you know, coordination are all things that are going to be affected. And so we really are concerned with abuse and addiction. When we're talking about illegal drugs, you know, it's kind of a yes or no thing. You know, are you using illegal drugs or not? With alcohol, you know, we're looking at blood alcohol content, you know, and when the person's on the job. So we do have to look at those from a slightly different perspective. Jason covered a lot of this ground about drug testing procedures for the CDL operators. There are laws in place that require it. 1988, the Ombudsman Transportation Employee Testing Act of 1991. And so this deals with our CDL operators. So there are laws in place that govern our, you know, drug testing our employees. Our employees have certain rights. If we're going to drug test them, they need to know why. You know, am I drug testing you as part of our, you know, CDL requirements, or am I drug testing you on a reasonable suspicion determination? You know, and so we need to make sure that we're making the decision to do that based on, you know, a legal reason and communicate to the employee, you know, what it is. We just don't decide we're going to drug test people just because. Okay, we need to have a reason for it. Utah Substance Abuse and Drug-Free Workplace Regulations. Basically, we are required to have in our policies and procedures a drug-free workplace policy. Okay, if you receive federal funds, you've got to have a drug-free workplace. Okay, and this basically means that we have a policy in place that helps us try to control use or abuse of drugs and alcohol in the workplace. And usually if you look at the states own policy, and a lot of your policies probably say the same thing because we model it after that. You know, we are defining this as, you know, not providing, that we have to provide a productive work environment, that it's safe, that we don't have the unlawful distribution, dispensing, manufacture, possession of controlled substances or alcohol in the workplace. We need to identify how we're going to correct the problem if it occurs. And we need to ensure the protection and safety of employees and the public. So having a drug-free workplace doesn't guarantee that we won't have drugs or alcohol in the workplace, but it means that we have a policy that we're following that tries to control it and addresses it when there is a problem. So you want to have a drug testing or an alcohol testing program, okay? One, what are your policies and procedures? You need to make sure that you have a policy that spells out when you do drug testing, when you do alcohol testing. You know, so we need to make sure that we have that policy, that it has had legal review, and that when we act on that policy, we are following that policy that we've adopted. You know, we have to make sure that we follow it consistently. Sometimes we have that employee that we're willing to turn a blind eye to. I don't come down hard on one guy and turn a blind eye to another guy. We need to make sure that we apply our policies consistently to all employees. We need to make sure we define what type of drug testing we're going to do and what kind of disciplinary action may result, you know, from the drug testing that we're going to do. So what kind of drug testing might we do? Pre-hire, pre-employment, is that okay? Absolutely, okay? If I drug test someone before I hire them and I don't give them a job, did I deprive them of anything? No, I didn't, okay? They didn't have a job before, I didn't give them a job, okay? So that's okay. You can do pre-hire drug testing. You should have a policy for doing pre-hire drug testing. How about post-accident drug testing? Yes, I have a good reason to test somebody. Now, if you're going to do post-accident drug testing, you should define what that means, right? Okay? Accidents can be pretty minimal. I get a paper cut. I go to the first aid cabinet. I pull a Band-Aid out and I bandage my finger. And then my supervisor says, oh, we're going to take you down for a drug test. You had an accident. You know, does an accident mean I access the first aid cabinet? It should be something more substantial. You can put a dollar value on damage. So if someone had an accident where they damaged $500 or $1,000 worth of supplies or equipment, maybe that's a trigger. Did we have to take them to the doctor? Did they have to seek medical treatment for the accident? Or did the accident result in somebody else being injured to the point where they had to seek medical treatment? Okay, so those are some examples, but we should define in our policy what constitutes an accident that is going to trigger the need for a post-accident drug testing to be done. What other kind of drug testing is there? Pre-employment, post-accident. There could be random, reasonable suspicion. You know, there's others. The big ones that we're recommending: pre-employment, post-accident, reasonable suspicion, and random where required by law or permissible by law for us, okay? So we want to make sure that we have that policy in place, that we're following that. So we are going to talk mostly today about that reasonable suspicion determination. There's a lot of other, you know, when we do testing, there's certain guidelines, you know, and if you look at your CDL program, they're spelled out in there very clearly about the guidelines of how the testing program is to be conducted. So that's something I don't want to go to in a ton of detail right here, but we need to make sure that we are, you know, not just doing the drug testing in-house, that we've identified a lab that we're going to go to where there's a medical review officer where, you know, we can meet these requirements. So part of the program is going to be identifying where do we go for drug testing, okay? Not just who makes the determination, but where do we go? Are they following the procedures? You know, we would probably want to make sure that they're splitting the samples so that we can go back and retest it if we get a false positive or someone thinks there's a false positive. So there's a lot of procedures we're going to want to check into to make sure we've got a good program in place where we're actually having the testing done. We mentioned pre-employment, post-accident. The state's policy that says critical incident. I haven't really been able to find anything that defines that for me, what a critical incident where. So, but I suppose it's kind of like post-accident. It could be where, you know, someone's involved in some sort of traumatic event that's happened in the workplace. I'm not, you know, really clear on what they mean by critical incident, so I'm not recommending it. But there is something out there for critical incident, reasonable suspicion, return to duty. So I've taken someone off the job because they failed a drug test, okay? And then I'm going to drug test them again before they come back to work to make sure they're clean. So return to duty is another instance where you may do drug testing. Follow-up drug testing, there's procedures where if you've had someone who's failed a drug test and you want to allow them rehabilitation, because if you've got a zero tolerance policy, there's no return to work testing and there's no follow-up testing, right? Zero tolerance, they fail, they're done, they're fired. But if we do allow for rehabilitation, we may have spelled out return to duty testing, follow-up testing. You know, under certain situations, you may have follow-up testing for up to 60 months after a failure of a drug test. And then the random testing for safety-sensitive positions. What is a safety-sensitive position? How do we define that? This is what we usually look at. It's a position where someone involved in that position, you know, they're not doing something that the general public normally does. And that's why we say just driving a car is not safety sensitive, because just about everybody out there drives a car. So when we're talking about safety sensitive, we're talking about functions that are not everyday commonplace, okay? So we're looking for something that the general public isn't engaged in on a regular basis, but where that activity is likely to contribute to or cause severe injury or death of others. So again, CDL operators, heavy equipment operators, public safety operators, people handling hazardous chemicals are all examples of things that we may look at and be able to define as safety-sensitive positions. For the DOT regulations, like Jason was talking about before, you know, you have a random pool consortium. You've got drug and alcohol testing. Jason pretty much addressed all these things in his prior presentation. The rehabilitation, that's optional. If you do opt for allowing rehabilitation, you know, you want to have some sort of follow-up program to make sure that it's actually working. Again, this was mentioned by Jason, 10% of drivers need to be randomly tested for alcohol and 50% for drugs. Or did I get that backwards? Alcohol 10%, drugs are 50%. You know, and I always kind of wonder, you know, what's more prevalent, drug use or alcohol use? So we have, you know, it seems like alcohol is legal, but we just do a real small sampling on alcohol. Prohibitions, okay, so this would be, you know, what can I not do under our drug and alcohol testing program? You know, I can't use drugs or alcohol while performing safety-sensitive functions, and specifically with alcohol during 4 hours prior to performing a safety-sensitive function. And so someone's showing up to work and they've got a blood alcohol content of 0.02, obviously, or 0.03 or something. They probably were drinking within 4 hours. You know, we can't report to duty with more than a blood alcohol content of 0.04, but if we're at 0.02, we can't work. We can't do that safety-sensitive function either. If you've had an accident, you need to refrain, abstain for at least 8 hours after the accident. Why would that be? How do I prove that I wasn't under the influence if I went out and had a post-accident drink before I went to have my test? Yeah, you could be shooting yourself in the foot there. So you have to make sure if you've been in an accident and you have post-accident testing, employees need to know, you know, don't go calm your nerves with alcohol or an illicit drug before, you know, you go in for your drug test. Refusal to take the test is a failure. Okay, so if I use right after an accident, if I refuse to take a test, that's the same thing as failing the drug test. Other prohibitions, any use of drug except by doctor's prescription and only within the scope of what the doctor's prescribed, you know, is also a prohibition. Testing positive for drugs, That's a yes or no thing, right? We don't do a blood alcohol content on drugs. You know, we can look and see the concentration of drugs, maybe determine, you know, if this person's really using drugs within the scope of their prescribed medications. But as a general rule, when we look at illicit drugs and our drug and alcohol testing, it's a positive or a negative on the drug test. So having a positive drug test is a failure. Having an adulterated or substituted drug test, in other words, you know, trying to adulterate your sample so that it doesn't come up positive on you, would be a failure. You know, trying to sneak somebody else's sample in there for your own. And again, refusal to take a test is a failure. Under the DOT regulations, you know, there are certain time requirements. We have to report, you know, these situations, and so we have to make sure that, you know, within a certain time period, you know, we're reporting and that we're getting the drug test done. So if anyone dies in an accident, Jason mentioned some of this, or the driver receives a citation within 8 hours of the accident and bodily injury caused to someone that required them to receive immediate medical treatment away from the accident scene. If a driver receives a citation within 8 hours of the accident and one of the vehicles had to be towed away from the accident. So we have these post-accident requirements that are going to be part of your CDL program, but could be part of your general policy as well. If a driver is not substituted or has not submitted to an alcohol test within 2 hours after an accident, we have to say why. And so it's really important that we get that drug test done as soon as possible. What happens if I wait, you know, 4 or 5 hours to do an alcohol test after an accident? Chances are the alcohol is going to metabolize, right? And they may look clean because I waited too long to take that test. So if we don't do that test within 2 hours post-accident, we have to document why it was not possible to do that test within 2 hours. If the driver is not submitted to an alcohol test within 8 hours, don't take the test. That's your window. You have 8 hours to give the test. You really need to give it within 2. And so if you're in that 2 hour to 8 hour window, you're going to have to say why you waited so long or why it couldn't happen. But after 8 hours, that window closes. So you don't do a post-accident alcohol test after 8 hours after the test. Post-accident drug testing is a little bit different because the window is 32 hours, okay? Someone's going to test positive for longer on drugs than they are for alcohol. That alcohol is going to metabolize out of their system. And so we have a little bit longer window, but still we need to make sure we get that done in a timely fashion. Post-accident testing is not required if someone just falls out of their vehicle, okay? So I'm going to be driving the vehicle and have an accident for the DOT regulations to be required. However, you may have a post-accident, you know, drug and alcohol testing policy that states, you know, if you have to have medical treatment for the accident, then we're going to do a test. And so the person may have just fallen out of the cab of the vehicle after it was parked and they needed medical treatment. So we're going to test them, but we're testing them under our policy, not under the DOT regulations. And again, we're going to let the employee know we're testing you in accordance with city policy or in accordance with DOT regulations. And if it's under DOT regulation, there's actually a form that you fill out that states that. You know, loading or unloading the vehicle, you know, would be another situation. So not everything that a CDL operator does is going to result in a DOT mandated drug or alcohol test. It's intended to be in association with the actual operation of the vehicle. Disciplinary procedures, what are you going to do? You're going to have a zero tolerance policy. You know, what's it going to be? An employee who refuses to submit to a drug or alcohol test, they're subjected to disciplinary action. You may want to make sure that's spelled out in your policy. An employee who substitutes or adulterates or tampers with the sample, that should be a failure too. Make sure that's spelled out in the policy. You know, that may be grounds for dismissal, but we want to make sure that it's clear, you know, not just what is a violation of the policy, but what the consequences are for violating the policy. You know, management may choose to take other disciplinary action. And so we just want to make sure that we thought these processes through. Again, the DOT regulations are going to have some specific things that are required. We may go beyond that with our own policy and procedures besides what's required by the federal law. When we do a reasonable suspicion determination program, we need to have one person in our organization that we call the designated employer representative. This is the person who's designated to receive the test results. We don't want just anyone, in your organization receiving those test results. We need to make sure we have this the DER, designated employer representative. They have to be an employee, not a contractor. They have to be able to receive communication from the drug testing facility. They have to have the ability to take immediate action to remove somebody from work, especially from a safety-sensitive position. So it needs to be someone who has some authority in their position, and they need to be able to make the required decision to do a drug and alcohol test. So we may do a reasonable suspicion determination training for supervisors. They may be able to make this decision that we're going to do an RSD, but there still needs to be that designated employer representative who's going to be involved in every instance when we do a reasonable suspicion determination, and is going to be the one person that the lab is going to communicate with. All supervisors of drivers or people in safety-sensitive positions have to have at least an hour of training on both aspects, drug and alcohol. We're going to kind of throw them in together as we go through here today. And they need to be able to put in writing what their observations are. In other words, if I do a reasonable suspicion determination, I need to be able to articulate what I'm basing that determination on. It's not going to be just, well, Ralph was acting oddly, and so I took him down for a drug test. We really need to be able to articulate in specific terms, what that is. So when we talk about doing a reasonable suspicion determination, we're going to look at different indicators. There's short-term indicators and there's long-term indicators. Short-term indicators, we have to have for a reasonable suspicion determination. We can look at someone's physical appearance, their speech, their behavior, their performance, could all be things that we base a reasonable suspicion determination on. But, it doesn't necessarily mean that all the things that we look at are short-term. Short-term is something that's happening right here and right now. A long-term indicator could be something that we've noticed over time. Maybe job performance has dropped over time. I'm not necessarily noticing today that this employee's performance is significantly worse than normal, but I've been able to track over time that his productivity has dropped off. That's a long-term indicator. I can use a long-term indicator in order to help draw my attention to a problem, but I must use short-term indicators here and now to justify the reasonable suspicion determination. So long-term indicators, like I said, will call your attention to a problem. You can look at quantity and quality of work. You can look at absenteeism. You can look at, whether they're frequently MIA. What's an employee who's MIA? Mission in action, right? They're there. They clocked in today. I can't find them. You ever had one of those? So, I often share the experience I had as a small business owner years ago. Right out of college, I spent 5 years running my own business, and I had this employee, and he would go MIA every day at the same time. And I would be wandering around, looking for him. Hey, where's Scooter at? Nobody knows where Scooter's at. And I figured out, hey, he is in the bathroom every day from 9 to 9:20. Very long bathroom break, And Scooter, before he would disappear, would be looking all ragged and disheveled and look like something the cat drug in. And he'd come out of the bathroom just on fire, ready to go to work, right? We got some indicators here. Well, the fact that he was always like gone, couldn't find him for an extended period of time every day was kind of a long-term indicator that should draw my attention to the potential problem here. The fact that he goes into the bathroom with one physical appearance and comes out just drastically different in appearance and behavior and performance, that's a short-term indicator, okay? And so frequent MIA, increase in safety violations. They just don't care, and so they violate safety rules. that could be a long-term indicator. It could also be a short-term indicator. A lot of long-term indicators can also be short-term indicators. Change in interpersonal behavior. So, they're really defensive or combative. They're arguing a lot. They are very cynical, or things that we see sometimes in people with abuse issues. Personal issues, they may be changing their topic of conversation. This person used to always have really great, fun conversations with you in the break room about, football games over the weekend, and all of a sudden lately they just talk to you about death and, things. You ever see someone where they just all of a sudden they start talking about something really morbid or depressing, and it's just total change in how they're, interacting with others. Also, rumor and hearsay is a long-term indicator. Now, lots of times we say, well, I can't take action on rumor or hearsay. And that's true. You don't want to go discipline someone because you heard a rumor. But if you hear a rumor, you may want to determine if it's true or not. So that's a long-term indicator. So if I hear a rumor that I've got an employee, his coworkers are saying, yeah, he smells of alcohol, or I think he's high, or whatever, maybe that's not something I hang my hat on, but maybe I go do an observation and see what I think. Maybe I will notice short-term indicators myself, and then that does give me something to act on. So don't just dismiss rumors and hearsay. You may say that I can't act on rumor and hearsay. Well, I can't take any definitive action against the employee on rumor and hearsay, but I can open up my eyes to a potential problem based on rumor and hearsay and make my own determination from what I observe. Short-term indicators, physical appearance. Just like Scooter's physical appearance would change before and after getting his, speed fix in the bathroom every morning. So their movement, balance, coordination, body odors are all things that we may look at with physical appearance. Their behavior, how are they acting? What's their activity level like? What are their actions, awareness? Are they, really focused, or are they kind of not able to focus? If you think back about that video of Bill, who was given the THC, he wasn't really able to focus too well, The lady at the end there is asking him, would you like to participate in another study like this? And boy, he was like, yeah, and that's the only thing he wanted to talk about. She kept trying to ask him different questions after that, and he was just fixated on, oh, yeah, I want to do this again anytime. You just call me. Ability to, be able to focus and those behaviors are things we can look at. Speech, volume, slurred speech, enunciation, what kind of language they're using. Changes in how someone talks is a short-term indicator. Someone may be aware that they're a little buzzed, and so they're very careful to over-enunciate everything they say so they don't slur, okay? And so you can notice these things. It doesn't have to be slurred speech that I'm looking for. If this person normally talks very fluid and clear, and all of a sudden they're being very careful about their enunciation, that's odd, okay? That's a short-term indicator. Sometimes you may notice that people who are, under the influence may talk a lot louder than they normally do because they're just not really aware. They're not perceiving the difference. Or sometimes they're maybe worried about speaking too loudly, or just the way they're socially interacting when they're under the influence. My God, I'm going to whisper, or talk really soft, and it's unusual. It's not the norm. So when you're looking at the speech thing, it could be a lot of different variations in how someone speaks compared to what is normal, okay? And remember, when we're looking at these short-term indicators, it's changes from the norm, okay? It's not even necessarily specifically one thing. You may have someone who over-enunciates all the time. If that's normal, then maybe that's not such a great short-term indicator for me, okay? Their performance, are they being, really careless, more so than usual? Are they making mistakes that are unusual? Is their quantity or quality of work changed? Are they being really unsafe compared to their normal activity? When we talk about doing a reasonable suspicion determination, remember, it could be on alcohol, or it could be on drugs, or it could be both, okay? but we have to make sure that when we do a reasonable suspicion determination, that we determine whether it's an alcohol issue or a drug issue, but we can do both because lots of times the short-term indicators that we're going to identify are crossovers. Okay, they could be a result of drug use or alcohol use. And so when we talk about this, we talk about alcohol as its own thing. And so we'll talk about some of the indicators of alcohol use, and then we'll talk about some of the indicators of drug use. Okay, we look at them separately, but you'll notice as we go through here, a lot of the indicators of both are the same. Okay, there's some things pretty specific to alcohol. The odor of alcohol on somebody, a body odor of alcohol on somebody, that's usually going to be alcohol. I'm not going to marijuana because someone smells like, you know, alcohol. But, you know, there could be other things with the slurred speech, the other things that could be from a drug or alcohol that crosses over, allows us to do both tests. So when we talk about alcohol, we're talking about a depressant, right? So some of the indicators we're going to be noticing are going to be associated with the fact that this drug is a depressant. People may have a slower reaction time than normal when they're under the influence of alcohol. Their ability to optically judge distance can be impaired under the influence of alcohol. Their coordination and their balance is going to be diminished. They may have seem really drowsy or really inattentive. Maybe they seem like that all the time. Maybe it's exaggerated. It's even worse than usual. Judgment's impaired. They're not going to make decisions in the same rational way that they normally do. Their sensory perception is going to be distorted from the normal. If we're talking about, you know, what we look at in drivers, when we do a defensive driving program, we talk about alcohol use. You know, this was a graphic we had in one of our trainings that kind of demonstrates it's not just at the legal limit where it's an issue. At 0.04, which of course is the legal limit for CDL, you have a measurable increase in your reaction time. It takes, someone at 0.04, you can measure that it takes them longer to react to something. At 0.05, you can measure the change in someone's vision, their coordination, you know, their ability to pay attention. Okay, so we can be under this limit of 0.08, and we can detect, you know, differences in someone's abilities or in their behaviors. When we're looking at alcohol, some of the physical indicators we might see, again, balance, coordination, body odors, glassy eyes. We may be aware that they aren't as aware as normal, so diminished awareness. They could be really moody, depressed, combative, okay? Irrationally combative. And you've probably seen people like that sometimes, where they just kind of blow things out of proportion and argue. That could be something associated with alcohol use. Speech, the slurring, volume control issues, and enunciation problems. Again, making mistakes, errors, carelessness, unsafe actions, quantity and quality of work are all indicators potentially of alcohol use, okay? Most of these are crossovers. Most of these potentially could be from one drug or another as well. So as a general rule, when we do our reasonable suspicion determination, we're going to be able to identify some of these indicators that could be either or, which justifies us in conducting a drug and an alcohol test both. However, if I am just kind of stuck with something specific to alcohol, like the odor of alcohol, you know, that may limit me to only doing an alcohol test. Let's talk about the drugs and the indicators that we might see of drug use. Now, as we go through these next few slides, you're going to see a lot of different indicators, and I'm going to have them associated with specific drugs. Be aware that when you do a reasonable suspicion determination, you do not need to identify what drug you think is causing the indicator. Okay, I may be showing them to you in connection with specific drugs. You only need to identify that the indicators exist. You don't need to say, I think this is an opiate or marijuana or whatever. So any of these indicators can be identified and articulated as part of your documentation for doing a reasonable suspicion determination. So with marijuana, red eyes, stained fingertips, chronic fatigue, irritating cough or kind of a constant cough, a chronic sore throat. Their heartbeat may be faster, their speech may be slower, they may have impaired motor skills, increased appetite, impaired memory, distorted time and space perception, euphoria, panic, paranoia, apathy, false sense of their abilities, okay? We're going to see these again and again. A lot of these could be related to different drugs. Again, you don't need to identify the drug, just that these indicators exist here and now if you're looking at a short-term indicator.
A councilman from Dearborn, Michigan is outraged over a 911 call. He wants to know why no charges have been filed against a police officer who admits to confiscating marijuana from suspects and then baking it in brownies. But when he and his wife were full and high, they thought they'd overdosed and called 911.
I think I'm having an overdose of my wife. Overdose of what? Marijuana. I don't know if it had something in it. Can you please correct me? Did you guys have fever or anything? No, I think we're dying. Okay, how much did you guys have? I don't know, we made brownies, and I think we're dead. I just thought about really slow.
So let me back up here for a second. So besides the admission that he baked some marijuana that he stole from evidence in the brownies, what did you see? What did you hear, I should say? Paranoia, panic, time, distorted sense of time, okay? And that's just from a conversation. You know, short-term indicator, is it happening here and now? Absolutely. So there's some examples. So cocaine, here's short indicators. Now, these may not be all-inclusive. You may be aware of other indicators besides these associated with these drugs. It's a fairly good list, though. Dilated pupils, okay? Now, if you come across someone and their pupils are just big and, you know, filling their whole eye all the time, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's a drug. I have a son, and his pupils have always been dilated. You know, it's the way he is, but he gets pulled over for speeding, and they want to drag him off to jail all the time because his eyes are dilated, okay? And so, again, it's a short-term indicator. Can you make a decision on that? Yeah. Does it guarantee that this person is going to fail the drug test or that they're guilty? No, it doesn't. But know that if you do the process properly, you know, you're not doing anything wrong either. Runny nose, profuse sweating, dry mouth, tremors, needle tracks, loss of appetite, isolation or secretive, defensive, absenteeism, false sense of ability, confusion, excitability, restlessness, high blood pressure. Now, I may not be taking their blood pressure or checking their heart rate, but these are things that occur. Insomnia, talkative, hyper, mood swings, paranoia again, confusion, depression, defensive. I think I listed that twice.
The night I used to look outside the window and I swear I see people in the trees and I call my friends, hey, check it out. There's someone out there, man. There's somebody out there. My friends will tell me, you need to get some sleep.
One of the common side effects of meth use over time is paranoia or unreasonable fear. And I'd like to hear your stories about paranoia. What have you guys experienced?
Looking at keyholes for hours and hours and hours, convinced that there were people walking by my door, hearing voices coming out of the shower head.
When we blast our brains with meth over time and go without sleep, we may experience what's called meth psychosis. We feel paranoid and afraid as meth stimulates the emotional center of the brain. We see things that aren't real as meth affects the visual cortex. And in the part of the brain that processes sound, we hear things that don't exist.
We have a more primitive part of the brain. It's known as the lower brain, the limbic system. It helps us feel appropriate sense of fear. No organism could live without being afraid when it's appropriate, because sometimes you have to flee from an enemy, you have to stand and fight, and you have to react instinctively. This part of the brain, this lower brain, is especially stimulated by methamphetamine use, by stimulant use. So now what was a natural fear response becomes an unnatural fear response when there's nothing in the environment to really be afraid of.
My paranoia was so terrible that I used to put on a bulletproof vest and start up shotgun and go outside thinking somebody was out there.
I had paranoia that I thought would never stop. I was afraid to take a shower. I was afraid to do anything. I kept thinking that everyone was in a conspiracy to kill me, regardless of where I was at. Initially, I thought it would stop after I detoxed, but it didn't.
Even after we stopped using, some of us had brief flashbacks, paranoia, and hallucinations. These symptoms fade as the brain heals, showing just how much meth changed our brains. This is a reminder that addiction is a brain disorder, not a moral failing.
So there's some examples of maybe why people react the way they do, but also kind of examples of how extreme some of those indicators can be, especially when it comes to people being defensive and irritated and paranoid and some of these other things that come with that. Opiates, and when we talk about, our drug and alcohol testing, we're looking at what basically is going to usually be picked up on a 5-panel drug screen. So we got the THC or marijuana, the cocaine, the opiates, again, constricted pupils. That's kind of the opposite. So someone could have really dilated pupils, or they could have really constricted pupils. Profuse sweating again, nausea, diarrhea, needle tracks again, loss of appetite again, slurred speech again, crossover with alcohol, slow reflexes, crossover with alcohol, depression, depressed respiration, so breathing slowly, slower heart rate, mood swings, impaired coordination, a lot of crossovers with alcohol here. You start picking up on these, you have no problem doing a drug and alcohol test, because there's a lot of similarities there. Depression, apathy, stupors, euphoria, drowsy, fatigued. Amphetamines, and of course that video was talking about meth, which is an amphetamine, but again, dilated pupils, and I could read them all, but it's pretty much, with a few exceptions, it's the same list again. So if you're familiar with some of these, then you'll have a pretty good idea of, some of the short-term indicators that you may be looking at. Any kind of behavior that is outside of the norm for a person that you can articulate what it is probably going to be something that you can document as part of your reasonable suspicion determination.
One of the ways that meth works is that it stimulates your brain to release all of its dopamine at once.
How does meth change our brain? When we use meth, it enters the bloodstream and travels to the reward center of the brain where it invades the sending neuron. Meth causes dopamine to unnaturally leak into the neuron, then spill into the synapse. Making matters worse, meth blocks the transporters, which recycle dopamine back into the sending neurons. This keeps levels abnormally high, overstimulating our brains. We feel a powerful wave of pleasure. The rush can last 8 to 12 hours from just one dose. This much dopamine makes us feel good, but meth overloads our brain. We can only take so much before we crash.
You think a day has gone by and, a week or two has gone by and then your body just gives up on you.
It was more of a blackout. It wasn't like a sleep. I didn't dream or anything. I was just out.
I was asleep for days. I was hibernating for days at a time.
Meth causes dopamine to flood our receptors. When we stay up taking more and more meth, we exhaust our dopamine supply. The problem is, our brains can only produce a limited amount of dopamine at once. Eventually, we feel like we're running on empty. The party's over, and what we want is more meth.
Unless I had meth, I couldn't get up the next day at all. If I slept for 10 hours, 12 hours, 16 hours, I couldn't get up. It's almost like a little panic. It's going on. Where's my dope? You know, where's my money? Where's my stuff?
God, I feel awful. I need some dope. Oh my God, I'm sick. I gotta call my friend and see if I can find some dope because this is like, this too much to bear. I can't stand it.
So meth comes into the brain, revs up the engine, and runs it at 100 miles an hour for days, using up our dopamine until our body runs out of gas and crashes. We need up to 10 days to refill our dopamine supply.
And what kind of indicators might be affected by those examples? Absenteeism, you know, people that just don't show up for work. You know, again, that perception of time is affected. You know, the panic, someone who may be, you know, demonstrating panic. They're scared, you know, unreasonably scared for different reasons. So see a lot of those indicators, you know, in these examples here. Physical appearance. You've probably seen this video before. I think this was done in Portland, Oregon, Washington County, Multnomah County Sheriff's Department. But just the changes in someone's physical appearance over a rather short period of time can be very dramatic. You know, severe weight loss, sunken eyes, sores in the mouth, on the face. This guy, he looked bad before and after, but obviously a lot of these before pictures were not before their addiction. So examples of what you can be looking for on, you know, changes in physical appearance, you know, and that's kind of a long-term indicator though. I've got an employee and over the last 6 months, you know, their appearance has changed, but again, that's going to be something that's going to clue me into what's the problem. Someone who's taking enough meth that it's affecting their physical appearance like that over 6 months or a year and a half, you're going to have a lot. I guarantee you there's going to be short-term indicators that you're going to be able to identify and articulate that go along with those. PCPs, again, a lot of the same things, but in different ways. We saw this with the meth as well, the panic, the fear, you know, the anxiety, you know, people having these terror attacks. They could become real violent. In fact, they can be almost like superhuman strong violent. It's kind of scary. It can be a really serious safety issue if someone is really high on PCP, you know, in or around you in the workplace. Confusion, agitation, really disorganized. I know you may go down and look at my desk and hit me on that one. You know, mood swings, again, poor judgment, auditory hallucinations. We heard examples of that also on the methamphetamine. Muscle rigidity is one we haven't seen. Jerky eye movements is one we haven't seen on any of the other lists either. You know, disorientation, time and space, a lot of these keep repeating themselves, so we look for those. So when do I decide I'm okay or it's time to do a drug and or alcohol test on someone? For alcohol, I need to have made a first-hand observation. So you're the supervisor who's been trained on reasonable suspicion determination. You need to have witnessed, observed these short-term indicators yourself. Okay, it's not going to be hearsay. It's not going to be something someone told you. So you're going to have a first-hand observation that was done before, during, or after the performance of a safety-sensitive function. Remember, alcohol is a legal substance. So when we're talking about it, we're usually talking about it in association with it becoming a safety hazard. And so you could also kind of just substitute that for on the job. If someone's under the influence of alcohol, I'm not going to do a observation of them and do my reasonable suspicion determination based on how I saw them behaving off the job, you know, on their own time. So basically we need to be looking for, you know, observations happening on the job, you know, when the employee needs to be ready to give service, if they're maybe on call, might be another example. And remember, we need to use the short-term indicators to actually justify our reasonable suspicion determination. What have I witnessed right here and right now? For controlled substances or for drugs, again, it has to be first-hand observations. It needs to be short-term indicators, but it can also include the signs and symptoms of chronic use or withdrawal. Okay, so it may not be someone who is actually high right now, but there could be signs and symptoms that they're coming down from a high, or they're in with some sort of withdrawals. And so signs and symptoms of withdrawal can also be your short-term indicator. It doesn't have to be in relationship to the performance of safety-sensitive functions either, if it's drug or alcohol related. So I only test for alcohol when the short-term indicators indicate, you know, alcohol use. If my short-term indicators are only ones that are associated with alcohol use, then I only am going to do an alcohol test. I only test for controlled substances when the indications are limited to controlled substance use. So if I'm looking at some of the short-term indicators and they're ones that apply to drugs but not to alcohol, then I may be limited to only doing a drug test on that employee. I can test for both, like we mentioned, when the short-term indicators that you are documenting, that you've observed and you're documenting, actually are indicators of either drug or alcohol use, both. Don't test for alcohol based on long-term indicators. We never do any reasonable suspicion determination solely based on a change in the person over time. It has to be a short-term indicator. If we're looking at a post-accident situation, make sure you're within that 8-hour testing window, and we need to base our reason on prohibited conduct. If we're just looking at alcohol, for controlled substances, it can be based on prohibited conduct, but the testing window, if we're looking at post-accident, is up to 32 hours, like we mentioned. So I've observed an employee. I've gone, you know, I think I'm justified in doing a reasonable suspicion determination. What's the actual procedure or process look like that I need to follow? So what we have here is a 6-step process that we want to follow in order to justify this reasonable suspicion determination and document it. So the first thing we need to do is we need to prepare, okay? I need to make sure that I've had the required training. So I've had my 2-hour reasonable suspicion determination training. I need to have appropriate forms. So the forms that I'm going to use for documenting, I need to have those ready. I can't just make them up after the fact. It's kind of going to be a time issue if I don't have forms to do this documentation on. If it's a DOT situation where I have a CDL driver and I'm doing an RSD based on, you know, DOT regulations, there's specific forms that I'm going to need to use for that as well. So make sure I've identified, prepared, created the forms that I'm going to use for this procedure. I want to have a reasonable suspicion checklist. So you may put together a checklist that has an example of short-term indicators that we can go through and say, saw this one, saw this one, saw this one. Now, you're not going to be able to put together an all-inclusive list, and so your list should also have an area where someone can write out, you know, what their short-term indicators are that they've observed. And in fact, even if we have a box to check, we should probably still write out and articulate what our observation was. What did I see? What did I hear from this employee? You know, what exactly was it that I perceived? So I may want to have a reasonable suspicion recording form where I actually document what I'm basing my reasonable suspicion determination on. A failure to complete testing form, specifically with the DOT regulations. If I don't get the test done within the testing window, then there's a form to fill out if I didn't get the test done. federal test notification and authorization. So if I am doing the test under DOT regulations, then there is a notification form that I need to fill out and give to the employee, telling them that they're being drug tested under federal DOT regulations. You will want to do the same thing if you're just doing it in conjunction with your policy and procedures. Some sort of statement, information to the employee that they're being drug tested in accordance with city policy. You need to have the telephone numbers and contact information for your lab. So I need to have identified, number one, where is the lab? What lab am I going to use? You need to have a relationship set up with them. They need to know who your employee representative is, your designated employer representative. So they need to know who they're going to be communicating with. A supervisor needs to have those phone numbers available, know where the collection site is, and where a backup site is. If I just have one lab identified and for whatever reason that lab isn't capable or able to take us in today, I should have a backup. So if possible, identify 2 locations where the drug test can be done so that you have a backup. And then put some thought into the transportation. If I have an employee and I'm going to send them out for a drug or alcohol test, I'm not going to put them in their car and tell them to drive to the lab, right? Okay, so I need to determine how are we going to transport them there, or who is going to transport them. Ideally, someone should go with them, probably a supervisor should go with them, and take them there. But definitely we're not going to put them in the car on their own, so we need to give some thought to transportation to and from. So if I'm sending someone to get a drug test and they fail the drug test, would it really be a good idea to let them go jump in their car and drive home afterwards, since I'm not letting them come back to work? So we should think about transporting them to the drug test, transporting them home afterwards if that's a problem. The next step is the observation. So I've prepared. I've got training. I've got forms. I know where the drug testing facility is. I got phone numbers and all that. So the next thing I do, I observe the employee. Remember, I have to have firsthand observation if I'm the person documenting and making the decision on the reasonable suspicion determination. So my observations need to be specific. I need to not just say someone was acting weird. I need to say what was weird about their actions. Well, their motions were very jerky and their speech was, very loud and over-enunciated, specific things like that. Contemporaneous, that's the short-term indicator. It means it's something I saw happening today, right now, as I am making this reasonable suspicion determination. I am able to put it into words. It's articulable, and I am identifying in words specifically what is it about their speech that's different. What is it about their appearance that's different? What is it about their behavior that's different? What is it about their odor that's different, okay? So that I am very specific. There's no question what I'm referring to when I document. That's probably the most important thing. If anybody comes back and questions whether you were justified in your reasonable suspicion determination, your ability to articulate your observation and what your short-term indicators are specifically is probably the most important step. Confirm. Now, this isn't a necessary step, but if possible, if you have another supervisor who's also been trained in reasonable suspicion determination, if you've done an observation and you observe, short-term indicators, ask somebody else to also observe and see if they independently, what they come up with. Don't tell them what you've observed. Just ask them if they will do an observation and see what they come back with. They may come back with additional short-term indicators that they can then document, or they may come back and be able to corroborate your observation as well. But if possible, it really helps to have a second pair of eyes also make an observation. Document. Okay, so it's got to be articulable. That means I'm going to write it down. So I want to have a reasonable suspicion recording form where I can actually specifically identify what are the short-term indicators that I've noticed. I want to be specific and detailed in my documentation, who, what, when, where. and what did I see and hear, even feel or touch, you know, if those are part of your short-term indicators. You need to complete this recording form within 24 hours or before the test results are made available. In other words, I don't want to take the person in for the drug test, wait to find out if it was positive or negative, and for what, before I make up what my short-term indicators are. So if the drug test comes back positive for THC, and then I can just go ahead and put in short-term indicators for pot and, you know, make it up. So I want to make sure that we have documented, you know, what our observations were before we know, you know, if it's a positive or negative test and what it was for. So within 24 hours or before the test results come in. Failure to complete the testing form, if needed, that DOT form for post-accident. And remember, this is going to be part of your confidential file, okay? I would treat this like medical information, so it needs to be treated confidentially and kept in a secure file. The next step is to confront the employee. Now, that may sound kind of aggressive. It shouldn't be. We want to be really careful about how we approach an employee that we plan on taking to a drug test. Number one, don't confront an employee about being high or drunk in front of other people, okay? That's just likely to cause them to become defensive, agitated, make it a really difficult situation, and it's just going to be bad all around. Get the person in private. Take them into an office, close the door, someplace where you're not being overheard by others, and talk to the employee. What you're going to want to do at that point is you're not making accusations. You're not telling the employee, you're drunk or you're high. You're telling the employee, look, I was watching you and I observed this. You were kind of stumbling and staggering a little bit. Your balance seems to be off. You know, are you feeling okay? You know, and you're going to tell them what your observations are. You're not making an accusation. You're just saying, hey, I've noticed this, okay? You're going to let them know that the reason you're talking to them about it is because you're concerned for their safety and for the safety of others, you know, and then you're going to let them know that your purpose is to confirm, you know, their ability to perform the job safely. So I'm going to have to take you down and do a drug test. I've noticed, you know, balance, you know, coordination problems. You know, I've noticed that you're not able to focus on your work. You know, I've got these short-term indicators. So I've noticed these things. I'm worried about your safety. Because of my position, am required to act on this information. And so I'm going to have to take you for a drug test, you know, and we're going to do this because we want to make sure you're able to safely perform your job, okay? We're worried about safety. Be prepared at this point when you confront this person. Now, you're trying to be tactful. You're not trying to attack. You're not trying to accuse. You know, you're doing this in a tactful way, but they're still likely to see it as a threat, regardless of you're being the nicest person in the world about it, because they may know there's a zero tolerance policy. They may know, or they probably do know, if they're under the influence, if they've taken drugs. They already know if they're going to fail the test or not, right? And so be prepared for them to get angry. Why do they get angry? This is kind of actually in order of how it might happen as well. Why do you think sometimes their first reaction is anger? They're mad, they're feeling threatened, and that first reaction of getting angry at you is really probably an attempt to get you to back down. They're going to try and they're going to get angry at you. How dare you? You know, and they're going to try and intimidate you, okay? Don't let that affect you. You've already made your determination. You've already witnessed what you need to witness. You've already, you know, I hope you've already started your documentation. Even if you haven't filled out the form yet, I hope you've made notes. You've written down exactly what you saw, where you saw, when you saw it, so that, you know, you have all that information. This is a done deal already. The next thing they may do when they find out that the anger isn't going to sway you from taking them to get a drug test is they may deny it. You know, of course, I'm not drunk, I'm not high, I've never done that. You know, they're going to go into the denial. And when they still find out that they haven't been able to convince you of their innocence, then they'll make excuses. When they start to feel that they're caught, You know, they're going to may throw at you a really good reason why they really needed to have a drink, you know, or something like that. Then we'll get into the apologies, promises, self-pity, tears. Now what are they doing? Now they're playing on your sympathy, trying to get you to not take them for the drug test. Please don't make me lose my job, you know, and they're going to try and play on your human side to, you know, not do this. And so it kind of goes through a progression of attack you, try and get you to back down, try and convince you that they're not guilty to, you know, please, I promise I'll never do it again, give you a second chance. It's really important you don't let this sway you. If you've made the observation, you know that the danger exists, you need to follow through regardless of how difficult it may be. And this may be someone you like. This may be someone you consider a friend. But if you let them sway you and you don't do the test, if you don't take them down for the drug test, and they later on get hurt or injured or hurt or injure somebody else, how's that going to make you feel? If it can be shown that you were aware and you did nothing, absolutely. You could have liability. You could feel some really serious personal responsibility in that too. So don't let this sway your decision. The next step is to actually conduct the test, take them down for the test. So call ahead, let them know that you're coming, make sure that they're ready to receive you, that the people that need to be there are present. You've got to have people who are qualified to collect the sample, and you got to make sure that their equipment is functioning and all that in case you may need to go to a backup location. So call ahead and verify that they're ready. You know, make sure that your transportation is available and make sure that you get it done as soon as possible, especially with alcohol. The longer we wait, if we drag this out, sitting around the office talking about it for 2 hours, you know, and the whole time they're metabolizing the alcohol, you know, and that test is going to be affected by that. If it's drugs, not so much so, but it's really important to have that test done as soon as possible. If it's a negative test, does this necessarily mean that you've made a mistake? And the answer is no. You made the observation, you've been able to articulate what you saw, you've got the documentation showing it. If hopefully you've got someone who can back up your observation and has made their own documentation as well, you know, so we don't need to worry about it. However, if we have a negative drug test come in and we saw these things, something may really be wrong. That's very likely. Let's say, you know, a lot of those things we're seeing in our determination, our short-term indicators. Let's say there's slurred speech. The person's having a hard time seeing and focusing on things. Let's say their balance is diminished, you know, their coordination's off. Maybe they're having a stroke. Maybe I shouldn't have been wasting time going to the lab for a drug test. Maybe we should have gone to the ER, right? You know, so it could be a medical issue. So even if you have a negative drug test or drug and alcohol test, there may be a medical situation here. So consider the possibility that we may need to assist this person getting medical attention potentially, especially if what we've observed is unusual for them. You know, so it could be a serious medical condition. If you're not sure, okay, you've done the observation, you've kind of documented things, but you're kind of on the fence, maybe a little nervous about pulling the trigger on this thing, just ask yourself, am I being objective here? You know, do I hate this person and I'm out to get them? Or am I really seeing what I'm seeing? You know, so ask yourself and to confirm to yourself, am I really being objective about this? Why am I doing this? Am I doing this out of some sort of animosity for this person? And so I'm maybe reading more into it than what's really there? Or is this really an objective observation that I make? Did I see what I saw? You know, so your decision is based on things that you can articulate and that you're seeing are happening right here and right now. Okay, and you should be able to confirm to yourself, that is the case, these are facts, this is what I'm seeing, I am being objective. The next thing you might ask yourself is, would my decision be any less reasonable if I did or didn't require the test? Okay, again, what's that question? Would it be unreasonable to not take the person for the test? How would I feel if this person went out and killed somebody, you know, and I didn't identify the problem now? Would somebody else agree with my decision? Look at your documentation. Would someone else in your shoes make the same decision? Hopefully get a second person, who's trained and authorized to look at it with you. Maybe if you're a supervisor, you definitely, I think you would be contacting your designated employee representative, because they're going to need to be involved in the process anyway, and say, here's what I observed. Maybe they make another observation for you, or at least they, look at what you've observed and say, yeah, that sounds like that's the deal. That doesn't mean you can't make that decision all on your own, but it's a really good idea to involve somebody else, but make sure it's someone who's authorized. I'm not just going to pull a frontline worker off and say, hey, do you agree with me that Billy Joe is, kind of off his game today? Don't involve other frontline employees. Make sure it's other supervisors or managers. There's assistance available, in these kind of situations. And maybe if you, aren't going to just execute a zero tolerance policy, know that there's a lot of venues that are available to people to get help for problems they may be having. You may have an employee assistance program that someone can call for help for addictions, which may be a good place to refer people to afterwards. You may require regular testing, to stay in a program that they're getting help with, or other sources of confidential help. So that may be part of your program. If your policy allows for rehabilitation and you're going to stay in the loop with this employee and hopefully bring him back to work, identify places where this employee can go to get the help that they need. And you may want to identify a variety of options because, different things may work for different people. Other resources that are available to you on OSHA's website, OSHA.gov, they address these issues of drug and alcohol in the workplace and the hazards associated with that. Also, Utah's UOSHA's website is another resource. And then when we talked about the federal DOT regulations for your CDL drivers, they've got really good resources for policies, training, as well as, information to help you in making these determinations available on their website at fmcsa.gov or .gov. That's confusing, .dot.gov. Okay, so other resources available to you there. So just in summary, remember, when you're possibly or potentially doing a reasonable suspicion determination, make sure you start out with the preparation, that we've got forms available, the training is done, and we've identified where we're going to go to get the testing done. Make sure that we've done an observation. Make sure that we've identified those short-term indicators, that we're able to put them in writing and be specific. Get someone to confirm your observations if possible. Make sure you have the documentation. Make sure it's started. I would do the documentation while I'm observing. I may transfer that information into the formal document later. Remember, that has to be done within 24 hours before you get the test results. Confront the employee tactfully. Don't attack them. Don't accuse them. Express your concern for their safety. Explain what you've seen and why you need to do what you need to do. Don't let them sway you with aggressiveness or with pleadings. And then make sure that you conduct the test according to your policy and plan that you've outlined ahead of time. Make sure you can answer to yourself that you are being objective. Make sure that you think about and remind yourself, if you're tempted not to do the test, what the ramifications could be if this person really does have a problem and really does wind up hurting somebody or themselves. And make sure that someone else would agree with your decision, and that goes hand in hand with getting someone to help confirm that if possible for you. Any questions? Yes.
We've been through this one in the last couple of years, employees. One thing with the alcohol test, we had the results, and it was like we took them in because they gave them a breathalyzer test, and it confirmed right away. So
you want to get that documentation done
before you go.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, you have the results right there, and then they did a second test like 30 minutes later, and it showed that their body was still like pulling alcohol into their bloodstream because that amount went up. So yeah,
So you knew they'd been drinking on the job.
Possibly like just before they put in the truck.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's that kind of thing, the alcohol part is pretty.
Yeah, and a lot of the drug tests can be really quick too. So it really is important to make sure you've written down your observations right up front. I saw another hand. Yeah.
With the drug testing, what panel?
Well, the standard 5 panel is what's required under the DOT regulations. You may want to spring for a more extensive one if you want to. I mean, they have more extensive panels, but the one that's required for the DOT regulations is the 5 panel. Okay. We actually did this section of the testing in about an hour and a half instead of 2 hours, but we didn't take a break. So if you guys will all agree that the break adds up to 2 hours, I'll say we're good. And make sure that you signed in on the sign-in sheets when you got here today so that we have documentation showing that you were here for the training. In fact, what I'm going to ask you to do, just because I think a couple of people may have snuck out, if you will put a star next to your name on the log on your way out so that I know who was here all the way to the end, that would be good. Okay, thank you very much. Okay.
We have somebody that comes forward and says, you know, I had a drug problem. We didn't catch him on the job and I'm going away to rehab. And, you know, we agreed that upon successful completion of the rehab, we'll retain your job or what have you. And is it within our rights as an employer to periodically test them for a period when they come back from rehab?
I don't know if I would do that if they haven't failed a test.
Okay.
If they failed a test and you had them tested, you know, then you could do the follow-up testing. But if they were just self-admitted going to rehab, I don't know if you really have that justification.
Okay.
That would be a good question for your attorney.
Okay, because I think we wrote something like that in our policy when we redid it, and I think our attorney...
And you had a legal review on it.
We did, yeah.
Yeah, I remember.
Anything like that. Well, we had our attorney review it too.
So that's probably okay. I wouldn't have just jumped to that on my own without verifying.
Right.
So that.
Right.
Okay. Oh no! Someone took them. Okay, I guess I'll just trust that the people who did sneak out didn't leave that early, so I guess we're okay. Thank you. Oops.
Because he's always been relaxed. Thanks, Doug.
You bet.